Ladies and gentlemen, this is Watson Michael from Ceylon Institute of English and Leadership. And once again, we are honored to have Mr. Sean Kidney back with us, who is the CEO and co-founder of Climate Bonds Initiative. Also, he's a professor in practice at SOAS University of London. And interestingly, he's on several boards. Okay, so the list goes on and on and on. Sean, welcome back. How are you doing today?
Great, Watson. Thanks for having me on.
It's an absolute honor. So it seems like it has become the new norm, living with unprecedented weather events. What are your views going forward? As it seems there are some bottlenecks.
Well, the biggest bottleneck is our lack of ability to adequately take steps to reduce the risk of oversized, extreme, severe weather events. That's the lack of action on emissions reduction. I mean, I've got to be careful here. We have started to change globally, but it's very patchy. The very fact that your current Prime Minister has been in China talking about energy investments and he's not focusing on renewable energy is like a form of modern lunacy, missing a trick, especially China, the home of cheap renewable energy solutions and finance. Around the world.
Small president, okay. Right.
Say that again, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, a small correction, not the Prime Minister, the President.
Oh my God, there you go. I've got to learn more about domestic Sri Lankan politics. It's been fascinating. You and I have been talking about this for years, but of course this is all fairly recent. So my apologies for not being fully up to speed. Your president is in China talking money, and it's not for entirely renewable energy. You've got these great targets of renewable energy growth by 2030. You need capital and technology from China in scale and volume. They're willing to do it. Make the right ask at least, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's because people aren't as conscious of what it is that we have to do. It's like the problem after next year that people feel, and they deal with what they know. It's a bit like the president of Mexico, the previous president of Mexico, AMLO, was an old-fashioned politician who was used to oil and gas being markers of independence and pushed very hard for the expansion of oil and gas, which is crazy because Mexico had a really fantastic renewable energy policy. It was booming, and oil and gas is going out. Bad decisions. Now, as a result, the sum of all of this has been emissions continue to rise globally. They're beginning to flatline now, but they should have been going down 8% per annum for the last 10 years if we were to avoid future event. And the difficulty with climate is there's a kind of latency effect. You put out a lot of crap in the atmosphere now, and it takes about 5 to 10 to up to 30 years to have an impact, because it's a big, complex system, but it does have an impact. That we are certain of, based on our studies of the atmosphere, atmospheric science. For the last million years, we can sort of see what's happened at different times. X happens and then Y happens. That's what we're looking at. And what's beginning to happen now is that climate change is having an impact. We've really almost breached our 1.5 degree maximum warming that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us. Don't get me wrong, we've got to keep that as a target, because as a global system, we have to have a shot at getting it back down to 1.5 to make life sustainable. If we settle in at 2 degrees or 3 degrees, we're going to lose billions of people on this planet. We need to understand that. The stakes, well, that's what the scientists are telling us. The stakes are very, very severe. In the meantime, because the climate is warming faster, at the fastest possible trajectory thought about 30 years ago, we're starting to have, well, big surprise, exactly the impacts that were predicted 30 years ago. We've got more volatile weather. Well, has anyone been watching the newspapers over the last year? All around the world, if you look at the international press, it's everywhere from Mexico to Brazil to the US to Canada to China to India, and so on and so on and so on. Like, it's just crazy. Last year was the hottest year on record for the planet. Not only that, it was the hottest year on record for every continent. It was the hottest year on record everywhere. It wasn't just a spike in heat in the Sahara. It was crazy weather. like dumps of rain, because of course climate change introduces volatility. I mean, it's a bit like if you warm the pot on the stove really fast, it boils everywhere and bubbles keep and the lid of the pot gets banging up and down really quickly, and suddenly you realize, oh God, I've overcooked, I've overboiled the water. This is what's happening to the planet, and it's becoming volatile, and we don't know how it goes. And what I can tell you with 100% certainty is it's going to get worse for at least 30 years, because 30 years is the latency effect. Emissions that we put in the last 30 years will keep playing out for the next 30 years, even if we stop global emissions tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So we're on a race to stop things getting really, really shitty, really bad. Let's call it catastrophic climate change. But we now cannot stop climate change. It's going to get worse for 30 years. We hope we can manage things to stop it getting catastrophically worse, but we've got to prepare. So understand, something's going to happen. The monsoon is going to fail on an occasional basis. The prediction in India is every 1 in 5 years. And when it does come, it's going to come in big dumps at odd times. The timing is going to go all over the place. The volume of rain this last year in some places in India has been extraordinary, way more. And look, you and I have been in monsoons. People in Sri Lanka understand this. It's pretty crazy in the middle of a downpour. Can you imagine 3 times the amount of water that we've seen in the past? How come we're not getting boats and fish falling out of the sky? Well, that might be the next thing. It's this think of it as lunatic weather becomes a norm. The thing that really worries me is heat, because what we're going to see and what we're starting to see are severe heat incidences around the world, especially on mainland India over the last year. But not only that, in southern USA, in Texas and northern Mexico, at one point in July, we saw what's called wet bulb temperature, when the relationship between heat and humidity reaches a point where the body can't perspire anymore. If you're outside working, you've got about 3 hours to live. So people have got to take shelter if they can. And of course, if you're working in a road gang, you may not be allowed to take shelter, and people will start to suffer. This has already been happening around the world. We're beginning to experience stuff. And of course, the further consequences of extreme weather incidents around the world, apart from mortality, particularly amongst young babies and older people, elevated death rates, you will see social dislocation. You will see economic disruption. People will not be able to work through this sort of stuff, right? You're going to have to go and hide somewhere in the shade and just survive until it cools down, if it cools down at night. Or you're going to be able to survive a storm. So economies get disrupted, and there's various flow-on effects, etc. So that's certain now, I'm afraid. I worry that we are so unprepared globally for the sorts of things coming our way. We will probably have to deal with large-scale incidents, with large-scale loss of life, like it took a tsunami a few years ago on the east coast of Sri Lanka to make people realize they need tsunami alerts, even though seismologists had been talking about it for years. And I don't know how many of these it's going to be. And by the way, it's not just extreme weather events. There are 3 features of climate change we know from the historical record. It's famine, the failure of crops, war, and pandemics. We will get more pandemics. They're guaranteed in the thinking of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Health Committee. The question is how we manage them and whether we keep loss of life down. We were lucky for the last pandemic. We only got, the COVID has about a 1% mortality rate. That's very low for pandemics. The SARS virus, which didn't get away into pandemic, we managed to take action to stop that a few years before, had a 20% mortality rate. The COVID pandemic mainly affected older people, people like me. The SARS virus mainly affected 30 to 40-year-olds. If SARS had got away, think about this, 20% mortality rate globally, largely amongst 30 to 40-year-olds. Now that would have been a horror for the world economy. just because we need people like you working, Watson, that way you can pay my pension when I retire. Otherwise, I'm stuffed. If a whole chunk of the working population gets taken out of economies, that wrecks economies. And these are parents of young kids we get talked about. So you get a lot of orphans. There's a lot of, and my main point is we were lucky at that particular pandemic, which sounds crazy, really, given how many people lost loved ones. Things could get really worse. We're going to prepare, for God's sake. Stop sitting on our hands and dealing with just short-term issues. We need teams of people put aside who just start working on the long-term issues and map it out. And that's everywhere. There is no reason why the Central Bank of Sri Lanka should have, in fact, a team of people who are looking at the impacts of climate change, especially climate impact in terms of severe weather and social education on the financial system, and start preparing. Are the banks of Sri Lanka adequately understanding the default risk in the context of new climate impacts coming through? Are they adequately understanding the potential flow-on risk, social and economic justification, to their loan portfolios? In other words, are they going to be able to survive a crisis with the new understanding of what a crisis involves? There's work to be done.
Absolutely, Sean. I totally agree with you. Right. So last year, the sustainable debt market passed the $5 trillion mark, which was a record. Can you
Yep.
elaborate more about that?
Well, the first thing I'd say, hurrah! There's a
Hurrah!
recognition amongst investors in particular that there's something they can do with bonds that meet their short-term requirements for investors, but also a long-term requirement to address climate and sustainability issues. So that's the win. And it's growing, and it continues to grow. The problem we have, and I've been saying this now for 7 years, it hasn't changed. The problem we have is the lack of supply. And by that I mean a lack of bonds for investors to invest in. There's demand all over the world. Now, there are some caveats. They're not going to invest in a bond from a renewable energy developer with a couple of plants on the southern coast of Sri Lanka. Bit risky, guys. Pension funds still have their risk requirements by regulation. They have. Banks still have their risk requirements set by the central bank. So it's got to fit within those frameworks. But subject to those frameworks, if they can shift the money to green, they want to. They just don't have enough places to shift the money to green too. So there's a lot more we can do. It's changing. More and more people are starting to issue green bonds, and those people who have green and social bond programs always want to grow it. The government of Japan, for example, has now a climate transition bond framework, and we certified their first bond, which came out in February last year, which is a $10 billion equivalent in yen. Great success for them. They want to grow. They immediately announced that a scaling up of the program, which threw everyone in the ministry a tither because they weren't prepared. But that's the problem with success. The trouble is they couldn't find enough things to allocate the money to because they're doing so well at raising the money. This is a good problem to have. I want that pressure to be there. The Chinese government has just announced it will start issuing green sovereign bonds in the European market. In fact, great news in terms of giving more options for investors. 50 countries issue sovereign bonds, by the way, around the world so far. Sri Lanka will, once finances stabilize, and it's able to do it. I've got no doubt about that. Corporates, subnationals, etc. It's a growing theme. There are limitations in doing it. One limitation is, have people got qualifying projects or assets to put the money to? Sometimes people don't know. They haven't figured out, they never looked at that issue. And that's an important part of the benefits of doing this. It gets people to look at what they're doing, which is in line with our future, what we need to do, the green future we want to do. Sometimes they don't have the capacity to do it. I mean, think of the Sri Lankan government at the moment with its constraints on national finances. That's a capacity issue. That applies to companies and corporates around emerging markets who may not have the capacity to issue bonds. So we've got to do work around that. Sometimes it's just purely skills. Sometimes it's not realizing they could do stuff in this area. There's lots of reasons. And that's a reason why this is going to keep growing, because in a sense, these are all relatively easily solvable issues. There are complicated underlying issues. How do you make low greenhouse gas concrete production in Sri Lanka financially viable compared to existing things when it looks like it's going to cost more, especially to set up? That's a challenge. It's really hard. That's not to do with the green. The green bond's not going to solve that. The green bond guidance will help you understand what it is you've got to do, but we need to be looking at how we transition industries, how we help them transition to achieve our public policy goals. Now, that's not going to be Sri Lanka driving that. That's going to be China, the US, and Europe, realistically. Sri Lanka will then become a beneficiary because the cement companies are going to start getting access to supply and technologies to do things in a different kind of way. And that's the same with renewables, right? The reason we have cheap solar now is because China, for domestic reasons, commissioned vast amounts of solar over the last 20 years, and that's built up an industry, large scale, and the cost of production has dropped like a stone. It's purely guaranteed by contracts to buy renewable energy that's driven that industry. Now, everyone else gets a benefit because the solar cell producers in China can slice off 5% of production or increase the production like 5%, and then that's free extra. It doesn't cost them anything to do that. And then they sell that to Sri Lankan folks or Saudi Arabian folks and so on. They make extra money, which is great. In Sri Lanka, we suddenly get, oh my God, look how cheap these solar cells is. What happened? So, you know, things like that are happening all around the world, which is why, by the way, it's crazy for the president to be looking at fossil fuel power nowadays, because frankly, renewables are just cheaper. And not only that, they're cheaper on a 20-year time frame, and yet they can last 30 years. So once the debt is paid off, which is typically 20 years, it's free money for a while. like it just, whereas if you book yourself into fossil fuels, you are at prey to international fossil fuel prices, which go boom, boom. Every time Donald Trump decides to frighten someone, the price of oil goes through the roof and gas goes through the roof. And suddenly Sri Lanka's got a big bill for the current account deficit for importing diesel, which just throws out the figures. This is crazy. I mean, unless Sri Lanka finds a massive field of oil and gas off the coast, off the southern coast somehow, which is possible but unlikely. Maybe off Jaffna is more likely, but I don't know. In other words, it gets its own resources to avoid all that stuff. Then this is madness. And you know what? Even if I found those resources, I'd be saying, look, build cheap solar locally, and if you get some resources, sell them to the rich and make some money. You don't need to be consuming that locally because solar is so cheap now. Anyway, we've got to explain this, Watson. You know, and people take time, unfortunately, to understand this stuff. This is why your podcast is so important. Getting the word out.
Absolutely, and we really appreciate, Sean, what you and Climate Bonds Initiative have done in the last 15 years. Okay, and still continuing to do, right? Great things. Okay, so can you explain to us about bridging the gap? How development finance institutions can accelerate private finance for a greener future?
In a way, it's simple. Think that we need to invest. These figures are pretty crazy in terms of the size of the Sri Lankan economy, but we need to invest somewhere between 15 and 20 trillion dollars a year on mitigation and resilience, preparing for the crises. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means things if you're building a water utility in a municipality that's not currently have access to clean water or wastewater treatment, you're going to make it in line with projections of what's happening, changing rainfall patterns and changing water use, right? I mean, when you think about it, it's obvious, but you'd be surprised how it doesn't happen. You know, the British here built a flood control mechanism on the Thames River because sea level rises and storm surges, the big part of London is at major flood risk. There's a thing called the Thames Gateway. So when the tide or the channel rises, storm surge, all that kind of stuff, they put up this gateway and that stops it flowing down the Thames. Now it's cool. It was cost billions. You know what? They didn't take into account climate change. They weren't thinking for the future. Sea level rises have an impact. Increased storm strength. And we're going to see a lot of increased storm strength around the world. Mean that a storm surges get much higher. So a combination of sea level rise and storm surge, this Thames Gateway is likely to be overwhelmed sometime in the next 10 years. And then for greater frequency after that, just because of that's what's happening in climate change. This is stupid. So one of the things we need to do, including if you're building a water infrastructure in Batikaloa, you've got to be able to think of the future. You've got to be able to take into account what is now inevitable, the comments I made earlier, latency effect, 30 years of warming coming in front of us and so on. We have the science, the predictive power now to at least prepare enough to be resilient. We can't be certain of how extreme individual incidents are going to be. But what we can do is design things that even if things get crazy, once you recover the next morning, you can get back to work again. You know, severe heat incidents. How do we build more shelters for people? Put shopping malls underground. They don't need to be above ground. There's no windows anyway, so that they've got thermal insulation and people can take shelter if things get really hot above ground, and then things can get back to normal much more easily the next day, etc., etc., etc. This is all about planning for a different world going forward. And of course, planning energy systems to take advantage of those cheap Chinese cells, etc. And by the India starting to produce cells too, trying to make them cheaper. So there'll be alternatives for Sri Lanka. You know, really, we have greater capacity now than ever before in history to understand the future. Nothing's certain. We can hit by mid-year tomorrow and everything's all over, but we've got as high degree of probability. Now, unfortunately, that future is a bit ugly because we've messed up our work globally the last 30 plus years, but at least we've got enough information to know what to do. And that requires us to start planning. Now, the bulk of that $20 trillion will actually be the redirecting of existing capital flows. If you're building public transport in Sri Lanka, you're already building it, but maybe you've got to build it a bit differently. You should not be buying fossil fuel, gas, or petroleum buses. You don't need to. Indian municipalities have been buying and leasing electric buses for the last few years. They've gone everywhere. They've gone viral. And I don't know what's happening in Colombo. You'll be able to correct me in a minute, Watson. But that's an example of an existing cash flow that you're reorienting to make future fit. Oh, that makes it easier. So the 20 trillion is not new money we've got to find. It's actually a shifting of what we're doing to make sure it's in line of what we need to build a future. Yes, there is some new stuff. We're going to have to invest in raising the height of the ports in Sri Lanka and in Batikaloa and places like that, because sea level rise is going to be there. That's an investment. That's new. That's a resilience investment going forward. Let's plan and figure out what we need to do, etc. We are going to, and we're going to looking at coastal protection measures in lots of low-lying areas around. We are going to have to think of our urban form because of the increased spikes in heat we're going to achieve. How do we ensure that buildings are cooler? Well, one simple measure is a lot more trees. Colombo already has a lot of trees. Is it enough? What about other cities, etc.? Well, I can tell you in America, we haven't been doing that. We've got concrete everywhere, bitumen everywhere. This is madness. It means the temperature on a really hot day is 5 to 8 degrees higher than in a place nearby that's full of trees. So that's simple measures, right? That's planning. That's managing the city kind of stuff. But it's also the thermal capacity. When we're building new apartment blocks in Colombo, make sure that you're using concrete and glass that's going to be ideal at high temperatures, and you're not going to get severe heat inside and people trapped in the severe heat. That's a building regulation issue. You get the idea. So much to do. So the bulk of that 20 trillion will be changing the specs of what we're doing anyway. There will be new capital flows, but it makes it much more doable. Really what we're doing is introducing engineering requirements in the same way we did at bridges 100 years ago. when we started building big concrete and iron bridges around the world, we had to discover, unfortunately, some crazy things. If you build a suspension bridge and you don't think ahead for oscillation factors and wind, you get some crazy things happen. There's a wonderful video, or you can get it on YouTube, of a bridge in Washington State in New York that got caught in high winds and started oscillating. Well, oscillating. It's like a reverb loop. And the bridge shook itself into pieces. Cars fell into the ravine below. People died. Engineers hadn't thought about this. There are curious things in engineering that we need to learn about. In that case, we had to learn about the hard way. And now every bridge in the world takes this into account. Now, is that going to be adequate given the much higher wind shear that we're going to get in the future around the world because of climate change? Not to mention the impact on strength of steel by having 10 to 20 degree higher temperatures. Are we prepared? We've got to check this out. Anyway, I'm going on what's on. Look, it's fascinating, right? It's interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's fine. But the way you articulate it, Sean, right? I mean, it's just not theory. Theory plus practicality is important, and you combine both, and you're explaining it. Okay, I mean, I just sometimes words don't come because I mean I'm learning, right? While I'm doing the podcast itself, sometimes I'm taking notes and I'm learning. Great.
All of these things are going to be green bonds.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot. So we've cast the 5 trillion level. We're going to be $50 trillion before it's normalized, and hopefully everything is done in line with the kind of climate challenges we have.
Absolutely. And Sean, recently, I mean, BNP Paribas, right, is a partner with the CBI and has been involved in several climate-related activities. Can you briefly elaborate about that?
Well, we work with banks all around the world. We have a membership program where banks subscribe to some of our information and we do things together. In this particular case, in Hong Kong, the BNP Paribas Bank, hosted a presentation of our new resilience taxonomy, informing some of the discussion we've been having today, which we published last September, and a dialogue with the regulator, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and with investors and corporations. So that was a partnership we had, and that's cool. BNP Paribas is one of the banks that has really pushed hard on green finance. In fact, I think they might be currently the world's biggest underwriter of green bonds. But, it chops and changes from while JPMorgan was, etc., while HSBC was. They've certainly got invested in it internally in teams of people to help their clients do more on climate-related investments in line of taxonomies, etc. And this is an extension of that particular relationship. So that's good. But, our program is open to everyone. So Sri Lankan banks could sign up if they were interested, and they could have a little bit of bandwidth to be able to look at these issues. In India at the moment, we're running a program in association with the Reserve Bank of India, looking at stress testing for a small group of major banks, climate stress testing specifically, look what the issues are. There's all sorts of things we do in partnership with banks. But banks need to commit to, they need to say, oh, actually, this is a challenge for our balance sheet and a challenge for our clients. We need to develop the capacity and capability to do that work. We need to partner with institutions like Climate Bond Initiative, but not only, about providing that support and services and, make a commitment to taking action. That's what BNP Paribas have done.
Excellent, fantastic. So Sean, I've just one final question, okay? A bit of an interesting one, okay? So the United Nations convened Net Zero Banking Alliance, okay? It was formed 4 years ago to leverage financial sector support for efforts to decarbonize the world's economy. So some top US banks have exited, including JPMorgan, right? There seems like a huge challenge, and it may influence other economies as well. And we're running short of time, and we have lots of more work to do to curb emissions. What do you think?
Well, the Net Zero Banking Alliance was not directly curbing emissions.
Okay.
It was a group to discuss options for doing so going forward. Things become political lightning rods. Right now, with the Trump administration coming in and the way it's looking at picking fights with anyone it disagrees with, if you're a an American finance institution, you want to be keeping a low profile. You want to get out of the limelight. So I can sort of understand why there'd be pressure to, hey, get out of here. Is that the same as them not doing business? No, it's not the same. Banks at the end of the day are traders of one sort or another, and they will do what the market requires. We can push them, and bank leadership, let's call it talking to their clients and what the clients need to do, is really important. But doing it in a really public way is valuable. But if they don't do it in a public way, it doesn't mean it's not actually happening. Within JPMorgan, there's a deep understanding this is actually about risk and helping their clients make money in a future that is changing, or a future that will be different to what it is now. That storyline hasn't changed. So public statements are one thing, public rhetoric. It's a bit like a politician. You can get a politician in Sri Lanka come out and say, I'm going to get food on the table of everyone who's poor. It issues what they're doing, right? Not what they're saying. Now, it's useful that someone changes the narrative and talks about that. So I'm a big fan of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. But of course, the real test is what the policies are. The quiet politician that doesn't say anything, but still gets into power and actually achieves the change, can be way more valuable, right? Well, let's see. Let's see how this pans out. I mean, there is a chance that the banks will say, I don't need to do this anymore. It's possible, but I think the world is changing. I think the action of governments and corporations all around the world means the green business is growing fast. JP Morgan's got a big line of green business, even though it's got a big line of oil and gas business as well. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
absolutely. So, Sean, wise words, okay? And it's good to know that you're working with banks around the world, and as long as they fall in line, you're looking for partnerships as well for green bonds to decarbonize. Great.
And by the way, JP Morgan is part of the Club of Bonds membership program, and they still are. Just so you know.
Wow, all right, I didn't know that. All right, wow, okay, awesome, great, cool. So thanks, Sean. And just before wrap up, any final words from you?
Keep up the good work in letting the world know about these issues. Change, at the end of the day, the change that really counts is action. The people who need to be aware of the risks going forward and the opportunities for the Sri Lankan economy, like cheaper energy, for example, are the ones who need to be really need to be aware, letting business leaders and political leaders know, and that cast changes is really important. So full strength to you, Watson, for the work on the podcast and the work at your centre, getting the message out. Keep the work. It's a really important part of changing understanding. This is a radical change. Pretty well anyone who has been in charge of guiding institutions and economies in the last 50 years does not understand yet what it is that we've got to do. There are rare leaders. There's a change the guard required, of course, but we need to draw this to attention because this is material stuff. This is going to substantially impact the lives of ordinary citizens in the next 30 years. We have to prepare. They will respond. People who are in leadership positions are smart people, otherwise they wouldn't be there. But there's new information to put in front of them. We've all got a role of making sure that happens and pushing them a bit because you get caught up with short-term problems. You get caught up, how the hell do I get rid of the IMF today, sort of stuff. And yet you've also got to deal with problems over the next 10 years. That balance between short-term and long-term is always hard, Let's help by getting that long-term conversation going and putting a bit of pressure. You've got to do this as well. It's not just about keeping the wolf from the door tomorrow morning. It's everything. I don't envy our political leaders, even the ones I disagree with. It's a tough and complex job trying to figure out how to navigate for the benefit of all in a society, which is why they all need all our help. It's all our responsibility. So, keep up the good work. Thank you for your work.
Thank you very much, Sean, for taking time and doing this valuable podcast with us. And we wish Climate Bonds Initiative and you all the very best.
Thank you, Watson. Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening in.